Owen Hart was set to make an entrance from the ceiling, and he fell from the ceiling. And I have the unfortunate responsibility to let everyone know that Owen Hart has died. Owen Hart has tragically died from that accident here tonight.
In the spring of 1999, Owen Hart, the Canadian-born wrestler from the legendary Hart family, beloved by fans for his technical skill and easy charisma, was at a crossroads in his career with the World Wrestling Federation. Known as the King of Hearts, Owen had built a reputation as one of the most gifted in-ring performers of his era. But in a company that was leaning hard into spectacle and edgier storylines during the so-called Attitude Era, Owen often found himself trapped in characters and gimmicks that didn't match his skill set or his understated personality. Owen's rise through the wrestling world had always been marked by undeniable talent, but also constant comparison to other more flamboyant wrestlers of the era, including most notably his older brother Bret. Trained in his family's famous Calgary dungeon, Owen earned respect across Japan, Europe, and smaller American promotions before breaking into the WWF. He was quick, technically flawless, and charismatic in the ring, but he was also the younger brother of Bret, the Hitman Hart, one of the company's biggest stars of the 1990s. Owen often wrestled in Bret's shadow, seen by many fans as the underdog sibling, as opposed to a rising star in his own right. Still, he carved out his own identity, delivering classic matches against top names and even building a career-defining rivalry with Bret himself that showcased just how good he really was. By May of 1999, at the height of the Attitude Era led by Stone Cold Steve Austin, Owen had been recast in a comedy-leaning persona known as the Blue Blazer, which was itself a throwback to a superhero parody he had played years earlier. It was meant to be tongue-in-cheek, a masked crusader mocking the over-the-top theatrics of professional wrestling. Owen played the part with professionalism, but friends and colleagues say he wasn't comfortable with the silliness. Still, as a company man, he showed up, put on the mask, and did the job, even as some around him questioned whether he should have been featured in a more serious role befitting someone from such a legendary wrestling family. Ever the professional, Hart threw himself into preparing for a pay-per-view event in Kansas City called Over the Edge. There were intense rehearsals for increasingly elaborate and dangerous entrances as WWF tried to compete for audience with grander and more dynamic spectacles. The event's producers wanted the Blue Blazer to make a dramatic, superhero-style descent from the rafters of Kemper Arena, lowered by a harness and cable. It was a stunt designed for laughs, the idea being that Owen would fumble with the release and fall clumsily into the ring, playing the bumbling hero before starting his match against a foe named the Godfather. But the stunt was not without risk. Despite being lowered from the rafters high above the ring, the equipment used was not the same robust rigging that had been employed by professional stunt teams in earlier shows. He'd even performed a similar stunt previously on Sunday Night Heat in 1998. This time, however, a quick-release mechanism was chosen for comedic effect, something far more prone to mishap. Owen himself was uneasy, reportedly voicing concerns to friends and colleagues about the stunt, but went along with the plan. And on May 23, 1999, in front of thousands in the arena, Owen Hart was raised high into the rafters for his entrance as the Blue Blazer. Just moments later, as Hart maneuvered to get comfortable with the harness and his cape, the trigger suddenly released, causing Hart to fall nearly 80 feet into the ring below, as horrified fans looked on. He was transported to a nearby medical center in Kansas City, but died a short time later from his injuries. Owen Hart was just 34 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Owen Hart.
In the moments after Owen Hart fell from the rafters of Kansas City's Kemper Arena, the wrestling world was plunged into shock and disbelief. Fans inside the building first thought it was part of the show, until the horror set in. Owen had struck the top rope with such brutal force, and he was unresponsive on the mat as EMTs rushed to his side to try to save his life. In the locker room, his colleagues stood in stunned silence. Some wept, others prayed. The Rock followed Owen's stretcher all the way to the waiting ambulance, walking alongside as medics performed CPR. Witnesses reported that The Rock pounded on the ambulance door, wanting to ride to the hospital with his fallen friend. For a company that lived and breathed spectacle, this was a moment stripped bare of storylines. It was real, it was tragic, and it was irreversible.
Jason, this part about The Rock is very raw. He talks about this sometimes. This is one of his brothers. This was the era when The Rock was starting to become a very, very prominent wrestler long before he was a prominent actor, and he was on the scene. This was a big event,
Yep.
And the tragedy unfolded right in front of them, and it had a haunting effect on The Rock, who still on anniversaries will sort of bring up Owen Hart. They were very, very close.
It was haunting on the wrestlers, obviously, but also the spectators that were there. I mean, he hit the ropes with brutal force. You've ever seen this video? It is horrifying to look at.
It's hard to find. They've tried to scrub it entirely. But
Bill Simmons found it for his documentary and the Mr. McMahon documentary. So it's there, but it is horrifying to watch. And can you imagine being a spectator in the first few rows? And again, I think you at some point think it's part of the act, but if you're there and you hear the sound and see the speed with which he descended, it's impossible not to know what's happening and it's got to be traumatic. Forever, obviously.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And they had gone so far with stunts that you're right. Some of the people must have thought this is part of the show. It's very, very strange.
For Owen's wife, Martha, the grief was overwhelming. She would later say that her husband had been uneasy about the stunt and had voiced concerns in the days before the event. Watching WWF continue the pay-per-view as the matches went on as though nothing had happened, it left her furious. To her, it was callous and cruel. Bret Hart, already estranged from Vince McMahon and the company after the so-called Montreal Screwjob match with Shawn Michaels, was devastated by the news of his younger brother's death. He later reflected on his little brother, saying, quote, "Owen was the best of us. He could make anyone in that ring look like a star, and he did it without ego, without bitterness. He just loved wrestling, and he loved making people laugh. When I think of Owen, I don't think of tragedy. I think of the joy he gave me and the joy he gave the world."
In the days that followed, the industry pressed pause to honor Hart and his impact on wrestling. The next night, WWF canceled all storylines and broadcast a live episode of Raw is War dedicated entirely to Owen, simply titled Raw is Owen. Wrestlers were given the choice to perform or speak from the heart, and for one night, the world of professional wrestling let its guard down. Rivalries vanished, characters were dropped, and many wrestlers shared their stories from the ring, including Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Steve Austin, Mick Foley, and of course, The Rock.
Owen, this is your night. And damn it, you know The Rock loved you like no other. So it's with great pleasure that The Rock, along with the millions and millions of The Rock's fans, dedicate the People's Elbow to you tonight. One time, Osh, if you smell what The Rock is cooking.
It was raw, unfiltered outpouring of grief for a man loved in every corner of the locker room.
I thought about Owen Hart remember a couple of years ago when Devlin Hamlin, is that his name, for the Buffalo Bills, was hit during the Monday night game, and they stopped the game and they actually ceased playing, and then later on they had to figure that out for the schedule purposes because they couldn't replay the game. But here, the WWF went forward with the event. Now, there were tens of millions of dollars at stake.
Sure.
And I'm sure that they, in the moment of crisis, didn't know exactly what to do. But to send all those people home, they'd have to give refunds. But it seems so callous in hindsight.
It did, although I thought they did it in the way that sort of worked because they stripped away all the pretense. They said this is not a real wrestling event. All the kayfabe,
Yes.
all the characters were stripped to the bones. And these were real men who worked with Owen Hart and were speaking from the heart. You watch that Rock clip, that's genuine emotion. I know these guys act a lot when they're speaking on the mic, but he was very, very sad and it had just happened. So there was a lot of tears. And it was, in a way, a fitting tribute, although you're right, a lot of people read it as very callous. On May 31st, 1999, Owen was laid to rest in Calgary, Alberta. More than 300 people attended his funeral, including a who's who of wrestling legends. For a family that had given so much to the industry, it was a devastating loss, felt not just in the Hart household, but really around the world.
The coroner's report concluded, not surprisingly, that the cause of death was blunt force trauma from the fall of nearly 80 feet. Investigations soon revealed the stunt had been rigged using a quick-release mechanism more commonly associated with sailing equipment than with high-risk aerial work. As mentioned in the open, the hardware had been chosen to create a comedic moment, allowing Owen to fumble and detach himself clumsily as the Blue Blazer. But the choice of equipment left little margin for error. The tragedy wasn't just a freak accident, it was the result of shortcuts, poor planning, and negligence. In the months that followed, Martha Hart filed a wrongful death lawsuit against WWF and the companies involved in rigging the stunt, alleging cost-cutting and unsafe practices had directly led to Owen's death. After more than a year of legal battles, WWF agreed to an $18 million settlement in November 2000. The majority went to Martha and her 2 young children, with Owen's parents, Stu and Helen, also receiving a portion. Martha insisted it was never about the money. It was about accountability and ensuring the world understood that her husband had been placed in an impossible situation. Years later, Martha sued WWE again over Owen's likeness being used in DVDs and other programming without her permission. That case settled quietly in 2013, but her position never wavered. She would not allow WWE to use Owen's name or legacy for profit. Instead, she established the Owen Hart Foundation, which continues to provide scholarships, educational resources, and support for underprivileged communities, a living tribute to the man she loved.
Within wrestling itself, Owen's death forced a reckoning. In a sport forever obsessed with pushing the envelope toward greater and riskier spectacles to please its audience, the tragedy reminded everyone that the men and women in the ring were not superheroes, but human beings with families, vulnerabilities, and limits. While WWE never publicly laid out sweeping new protocols, insiders agreed that stunts became more tightly controlled, with licensed riggers, safer equipment, and a deeper awareness of the risks involved. The company retired the Over the Edge event name, and the Blue Blazer character was permanently shelved. Wrestling by nature has always carried risk, but never again would a stunt like the one in Kansas City be treated as just another storyline gag. Jason, I wanted to pause really quickly. The outpouring of grief was the first moment, and then there was really a lot of anger. Those lawsuits, the family felt very strongly. This is a very proud wrestling family. They were mad that one of their own was put in this very difficult situation.
Well, they should be. I mean, that could have been any of them, right? The taking shortcuts in order for a more comedic effect or whatever it might be is outlandish. Now, I will say, lawyers get a bad rap a lot, but lawyers, by bringing lawsuits, also cause change. And to the point you just raised, right, the fact that this mistake was made and the lawyers descended and took millions and millions of dollars, now we have a safer sport.
Yes.
And that's all you can take from it that's positive. All you can do is say, well, at least it cleaned it up so other people will not suffer the same fate, hopefully. And you look to that as a positive, but it's still the fact they let it happen in the first place. They allowed it to happen. They cut these corners it's outrageous.
Extremely upsetting stuff. And you're right. The positive is that the stunts are safer. She has started the Owen Hart Foundation. Time has passed and that has softened some of this, but when you look back at it, it didn't need to happen. It was a comedic rig that cost somebody his life. Owen Hart was born into wrestling royalty, but the arc of his career was less the firstborn king in waiting like Prince William, and more that of younger brother, an irrepressible scamp like a Prince Harry. The youngest of Stu and Helen Hart's 12 children, he grew up in Calgary's legendary Hart House, where the family's basement dungeon became one of the most feared and respected training grounds in the sport. Under Stu's guidance, generations of wrestlers learned the craft of holds, counters, and psychology, and Owen absorbed it all from the time he could walk. By the time he entered the ring as a young man, he was already fluent in the language of wrestling. The Hart family name carried enormous weight in the wrestling world, and Owen upheld it with dignity. He was part of the second wave of the family dynasty, alongside Bret, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, Davey Boy Smith, and Brian Pillman. Together, they extended the reach of the Hart legacy beyond Calgary Stampede Wrestling into the global spotlight of the WWF.
In an era where professional wrestling was dominated by larger-than-life bodies and exaggerated personas, Owen carved out a different lane. He wasn't the biggest man in the ring, but he was one of the most technically gifted. His background in amateur wrestling gave him crisp execution, while his natural athleticism made him one of the smoothest high flyers of his generation. Moves like his missile dropkick, enziguri, where a wrestler kicks an opponent in the back of the head as a countermaneuver, and his signature sharpshooter weren't just crowd pleasers. They set new standards for what a well-rounded wrestler could be in the ring as the sport moved away from the plodding focus on grappling from the early days with Andre the Giant and others. Though Owen sometimes struggled to escape the shadow of his older brother Bret, who became a world champion and global icon, Owen often leaned into the natural contrast. Bret was stoic, measured, and polished, the excellence of execution. Rather than trying to match or exceed the flamboyance of his opposition, Bret carved out a persona that was the epitome of cool, calm, and collected. Owen, by comparison, was fiery, mischievous, and unpredictable. Their on-screen rivalry, culminating in their legendary match at WrestleMania 10 in 1994, remains one of the most acclaimed brother-versus-brother feuds in wrestling history. That bout wasn't just a family storyline. It was a showcase of pure wrestling artistry, two masters telling a story through precision and emotion.
But Owen was more than just Brett's foil. Throughout the 1990s, he developed into one of the most versatile performers in WWF. He was just as comfortable working comedic angles, such as his run as the over-the-top King of Hearts, as he was in hard-hitting mid-card classics. Tag team wrestling, in particular, was a playground for his talents. With Yokozuna, Jeff Jarrett, and others, Owen became a multi-time WWF Tag Team Champion, showing an ability to elevate partners and opponents alike. Partly because he was comfortable in multiple styles, he never really developed into a signature and unique character that broke out into superstardom. His versatility was part of the reason for his relative anonymity when compared to the brightest stars of the day like The Rock with his signature catchphrases or Stone Cold Steve Austin beer can crushing antics. Behind the scenes, his peers knew him as a wrestler's wrestler. He was famous for playing ribs and lightening the mood in the locker room, but when the bell rang, he was all business. Younger talents often sought him out for advice, and veterans respected his consistency. He had a reputation for being safe in the ring, someone you could trust with your body match after match. In a profession where careers are often shortened by reckless bumps or sloppy execution, Owen's professionalism really stood out.
Makes the death and the way that it happened so
ironic,
right?
It's really, really sad. When I read into his story, I was excited to do this episode because I remember the death very well. I was somewhat into wrestling at the time, and it was strange and eerie that this guy died in the ring doing a stunt because wrestling was so over the top at the time. And I was like, this seemed destined to happen in some way. But when I learned that he was known for being safe about wrestling, people loved to wrestle with him because he would do the moves in a way that kept
precision and execute. He was known for his execution. All of a sudden, it happens in such a poorly executed way.
If this had happened to a reckless gunslinger who was known for being reckless, it would sort of land differently and feel differently, but that just wasn't Owen Hart.
Owen's influence can be felt in the generations that followed. Wrestlers like Chris Jericho, Daniel Bryan, and Seth Rollins, performers who built their reputations on a blend of athleticism, precision, and storytelling, have acknowledged their debt to the style Owen helped normalize. In many ways, he was a bridge between the mat-based discipline of old-school wrestling and the faster, hybrid style that defines today's sport. For fans and peers alike, Owen Hart represented the complete package: technical mastery, athletic grace, and a human touch that made him deeply relatable. He wasn't always the face of the company, and he rarely got the main event spotlight, but his consistency and skill made him the backbone of the shows he was on. In a business built on spectacle, Owen stood out for something more enduring: excellence, humility, and an authenticity that made every match matter. And perhaps that is his greatest legacy. Long after the titles and rivalries fade into memory, Owen Hart is remembered as a craftsman, a professional, and a man who made everyone around him better. He carried the Hart family tradition forward while leaving his own indelible mark on the wrestling world.
In the days and years after Owen's death, those who loved him most were left with a void that was impossible to fill. For Bret Hart, who had shared not only the bond of family, but the bond of the ring with his younger brother, the loss was searing. He spoke often about Owen's warmth, his humor, and his quiet brilliance as a wrestler who never sought the spotlight, but always stole the show once the bell rang. Bret remembered their matches together not as scripted rivalries, but as conversations between brothers told through headlocks, suplexes, and near falls, a story only the two of them could tell. To Bret, Owen was more than just a great performer cut down in his prime. He was the brother who kept the Hart family grounded, the friend who could light up a locker room with a prank or a smile, and the reminder that wrestling was supposed to be fun. And so I wanted to give the final word to Bret, heard here talking about what his brother meant to him and the wrestling world.
With Owen, it's so nice that so many people remember him all the time, and they remember him in a certain way, like different than what you hear about other wrestlers. They remember Owen for all of his kind acts, and I think that's how I like to remember him.